I never thought I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office at 72, staring down a daughter-in-law who looked at me like I was a piece of gum stuck to her designer shoe. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, especially when those curveballs come wrapped in grief and greed. My son Daniel had been dead for exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks since I got that phone call that every mother dreads. The one that shatters your world into a million pieces that you'll never quite fit back together the same way. Daniel wasn't just my only child. He was my whole world, my best friend, and honestly, the only person who still laughed at my terrible jokes about getting old. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The thing about Daniel was that he'd become something I never saw coming. 2 years ago, he was just my sweet boy who worked in IT and lived in a modest apartment downtown, spending his weekends helping me reorganize my closets and fixing my ancient computer when it decided to have what he called senior moments. He was the kid who'd rather read a book than go to parties, who collected vintage comic books, and who still called me every morning on his way to work just to check in. Then, he started making these videos online, talking about mental health, sharing his story about overcoming anxiety and depression. It started innocently enough, just a little camera set up in his bedroom, talking to maybe 50 people who'd found his channel by accident. I remember him showing me his first video, nervous and excited, asking what I thought. "You're helping people, sweetheart," I told him, though I didn't really understand what subscribers meant or why strangers on the internet cared about my son's opinion. But Daniel had something special, something that transcended the screen. He talked about panic attacks with the authority of someone who'd lived through them. He discussed therapy without shame, medication without stigma, healing without false promises of easy fixes. When he talked about the night he almost didn't make it, when he shared how I'd driven across town at 2 a.m. just to sit with him until the crisis passed, people listened, really listened. I didn't really understand it at first, this whole internet thing, but Daniel had a way of making people feel seen, heard, understood. His comment sections became virtual support groups. People shared their own stories, their own struggles, their own victories. He'd spend hours responding to messages, often staying up until dawn to talk someone through a dark moment. The growth was exponential and terrifying. First 1,000 subscribers, then 10,000, then hundreds of thousands. Before I knew it, he had millions of followers, hanging on his every word. Major brands started reaching out, offering him more money for a single sponsored post than I'd made in a year of teaching. Mental health organizations wanted him as a spokesperson. Publishers offered book deals. Streaming services pitched documentary ideas. But what really changed everything was when he started the foundation. It began with Daniel reading comments from people who couldn't afford therapy, people who were struggling with mental health issues but didn't have insurance, or whose insurance wouldn't cover treatment. He started small, just paying for a few therapy sessions here and there, but as his platform grew, so did his ability to help. The Daniel Thompson Foundation for Mental Health Access became a legitimate operation, funding therapy for thousands of people who otherwise couldn't afford it. He hired staff, worked with licensed therapists, created a whole infrastructure for mental health support. The money from his brand partnerships, his merchandise, his speaking engagements, it all went back into helping people. My quiet, introverted son had become what they call an influencer, though he always hated that term. "I'm not influencing anyone, Mom," he'd say whenever I used that word. "I'm just sharing my truth, and if that helps people find their own truth, then that's beautiful." He never lost that humble perspective, never let the fame go to his head, never forgot that behind every username was a real person dealing with real pain. The money started rolling in faster than either of us could comprehend. We're talking millions, not thousands. Daniel bought a beautiful house in the hills, traded his old Honda for a Tesla. But you know what he never changed? He still called me every Sunday, still brought me groceries when my arthritis was acting up, still made terrible puns that made me groan and laugh at the same time. Then he met Cassandra. Now, I want to be fair here. When your son introduces you to his girlfriend, you try to give her the benefit of the doubt, even when every instinct you have is screaming warnings. Cassandra was beautiful in that Instagram way. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect everything. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, all glossy surfaces and calculated angles. She had her own social media following, though significantly smaller than Daniel's, focused on what she called luxury lifestyle content. This meant showing off expensive handbags and restaurant visits, and basically everything I thought was vapid and meaningless. But hey, I'm old-fashioned. I'll never forget the first time Daniel brought her to my house for dinner. I'd spent all day making his favorite meal, pot roast with those little potatoes he loved as a kid, green beans from my garden, and my grandmother's apple pie recipe. Simple, comforting food made with love. Cassandra arrived wearing white jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill, carrying a designer purse that I later learned was worth several $1,000s. "Oh, how charming," she said when she saw my little house, and I could hear the condescension dripping from every word. "It's so vintage." She said vintage like it was a disease. During dinner, she barely touched the food, claiming she was mostly plant-based now and had already eaten. She spent most of the meal taking photos of herself with Daniel, adjusting the lighting with her phone's flash, asking him to look more natural for the camera. Daniel seemed enchanted by her attention, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, eager to please her in a way that made my mother's heart ache. "Daniel tells me you used to be a teacher," she said to me, scrolling through her phone while she talked. "That must have been fulfilling in its own way." "It was," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "I taught high school English for 35 years. Loved every minute of it." "Oh, I could never do that," she laughed, still not looking up from her screen. "All those hormonal teenagers? And the pay. Well, Daniel says you're doing fine now that you're retired, but it must have been hard living on a teacher's salary all those years." What bothered me wasn't her content or even her obvious obsession with material things. It was the way she looked at Daniel, not with love, not with admiration for the person he was, but with calculation, like she was adding up his net worth every time he spoke. When Daniel talked about his charity work, his face lighting up as he described a young woman whose life had been saved by the therapy funding they'd provided. Cassandra would nod politely, but I caught her rolling her eyes when she thought no one was looking. After dinner, as I was clearing dishes, I overheard her talking to Daniel in the living room. "Babe, this is all very sweet, but don't you think your charity work is getting a little excessive? I mean, you're literally giving away millions of dollars to strangers. That's money we could be investing, building our future together." "It's not our money, Cass," Daniel replied, and I could hear the slight tension in his voice. "It's money I earn because people trust me to use my platform responsibly. I can't just take that trust and turn it into personal profit." "But you could scale back a little," she pressed. "Maybe be more selective. Focus on building your brand instead of trying to save the world." "My brand is saving the world," Daniel said firmly, and I felt a surge of pride at my son's conviction. There was a pause, then Cassandra's voice turned sweet and manipulative. "Of course, baby. I love how passionate you are. I just want to make sure you're not burning yourself out. You work so hard, and I worry about you." But I heard what she didn't say. I heard the calculation behind every word, the way she was planting seeds of doubt about the very thing that gave Daniel's life meaning. She was subtle about it, I'll give her that, always framing her concerns as caring, as worry for his well-being, as love. The red flags kept coming. She'd show up to family events with professional photographers, turning every birthday, every holiday, every gathering into a photo shoot. She'd interrupt conversations to take selfies, pose Daniel in specific positions, adjust his clothing or hair to look better for the camera. Our family dinners became content creation sessions, and Daniel seemed to think this was normal, even romantic. "She's helping me build my brand, Mom," he'd say, when I gently questioned why every moment of his life needed to be documented and shared. "She understands the business side of this better than I do." What Daniel didn't see, but I did, was how Cassandra talked differently when she thought he wasn't listening. To me, she'd complain about how boring his friends were, how exhausting his charity events were, how she wished he'd focus more on monetizing his influence instead of giving it away for free. To other people, she'd hint about their future plans, the bigger house they'd buy, the expensive vacations they'd take, the luxury lifestyle his success would afford them. She never mentioned the foundation, never talked about the good work he was doing, never seemed to understand that for Daniel, helping people wasn't a side project. It was the entire point. They got married 6 months after meeting, and the engagement announcement was, predictably, a social media extravaganza. Cassandra posted professional photos of the proposal, which had been staged at a luxury resort in Malibu, with a photographer conveniently hidden behind nearby rocks, along with close-up shots of her enormous engagement ring. The comment section was flooded with congratulations and questions about wedding plans, brand partnerships, and whether they'd be documenting their journey to the altar. The wedding itself was a lavish affair that cost more than my first house, and I swear half the guests were there for the Instagram photos rather than to celebrate love. It was held at an exclusive vineyard in Napa Valley, with every detail coordinated by a team of wedding planners who specialized in influencer events. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll admit, but it felt more like a corporate production than a sacred union. I remember sitting in the front row, watching my son promise to love and cherish this woman, and feeling a deep unease that I couldn't shake. Daniel looked genuinely happy, radiant even, but Cassandra looked like a woman who'd just closed the deal of a lifetime. The reception featured 3 different photographers, a videographer team, and a social media coordinator whose job was to manage the official hashtag and ensure optimal posting times for maximum engagement. Guests were given guidelines about what to share and when, and there was an actual media kit with suggested captions and photo angles. During the father-daughter dance, mother-son dance, since Daniel's father had passed when he was 12, my boy whispered in my ear, "I love you, Mom. Thank you for always believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." "I love you too, sweetheart," I whispered back, trying to ignore the way Cassandra was positioned at the edge of the dance floor, directing a photographer to capture specific angles of our moment together. The honeymoon was documented extensively across both their social media accounts. 2 weeks in the Maldives, staying in an overwater villa that cost more per night than most people make in a month. But even in paradise, I noticed something in Daniel's posts that troubled me. His usual authenticity seemed strained, his captions less genuine, his photos more posed. It was subtle, but I knew my son. Something was changing. When they returned, Daniel seemed different, still loving, still checking on me regularly, but there was a tension in him that hadn't been there before. He'd started second-guessing his charitable work, asking questions about whether he was being too generous, or if he should be more strategic about his giving. These weren't thoughts that had ever occurred to him before, and I had a pretty good idea where they were coming from. Daniel seemed happy, though, or at least he seemed to think he was happy. That's what I kept telling myself when I saw the subtle changes in him, the way his spontaneous generosity was becoming more calculated, the way his genuine concern for others was being filtered through questions of brand alignment and strategic impact. The marriage lasted exactly 4 months, though I didn't know it was ending until after it was over. Daniel died in what the police called a tragic accident. He was found at the bottom of the stairs in their multi-million-dollar home in the Hollywood Hills, apparently having fallen and hit his head on the marble floor of their entryway. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma resulting from an accidental fall. Cassandra's story was seamless and tragic. She claimed she'd been out getting her nails done for a charity gala they were supposed to attend that evening and came home to find him. She'd called 911 immediately, she said, tried to revive him herself, was devastated that she couldn't save him. The paramedics found her sobbing over his body, her designer dress stained with his blood, the picture of a grief-stricken widow. The timing was convenient, I thought, but grief makes you paranoid. Or so I told myself, or so everyone else told me when I dared to voice my suspicions. "Eleanor, you're in shock," well-meaning friends would say. "You're looking for someone to blame because accidents are too random, too senseless. But sometimes terrible things just happen." But I knew my son. Daniel was athletic, coordinated, careful. He'd been climbing those stairs every day for months. They were well lit, not steep, with a sturdy railing. He was 28 years old, in perfect health, with the reflexes of someone who ran marathons for fun. The idea that he'd simply lost his footing and fallen hard enough to die seemed impossible to me. The police investigation was perfunctory. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no indication of foul play. Cassandra's alibi checked out. She was indeed at the nail salon, with timestamps on her credit card and security footage showing her arrival and departure. The salon staff confirmed she'd been there, getting an elaborate manicure and pedicure that took nearly 3 hours. But here's what bothered me. Cassandra had never gotten her nails done before an event. She had a personal manicurist who came to the house twice a week. Why would she suddenly decide to go to a public salon on the day of an important charity gala, the kind of event where appearances mattered most to her? When I mentioned this to the detective assigned to the case, he looked at me with the kind of patronizing sympathy reserved for hysterical mothers. "Mrs. Thompson, Grief can make us see patterns that aren't there. Sometimes people change their routines for no particular reason. Maybe she wanted to try a new place. Maybe her regular person wasn't available. There's no evidence to suggest anything suspicious happened here. The funeral was a circus that would have horrified Daniel if he'd been alive to see it. His fans showed up by the hundreds, turning his memorial into some kind of social media event. People live-streamed the service, posted tribute videos in the parking lot, and created an impromptu shrine of flowers, cards, and fan art that stretched for blocks around the funeral home. Cassandra played the grieving widow beautifully, posting heartfelt tributes and black-and-white photos of herself looking devastated. She even started a Daniel's Legacy hashtag that went viral. It made me sick, but I was too numb with grief to fight it. Which brings me to today, sitting in this sterile conference room with its fluorescent lights and the smell of fresh coffee that nobody was drinking. The law office of Pemberton, Walsh and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, all glass and steel, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. Lawrence Pemberton, Daniel's lawyer, sat at the head of the polished oak table with a manila folder that apparently contained my son's final wishes. Cassandra sat across from me, dressed in designer black that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, flanked by two lawyers who looked like they charged by the minute just to breathe. Her grief outfit was impeccable, a Chanel suit that managed to be both mourning appropriate and Instagram ready, with just enough subtle jewelry to remind everyone that she was wealthy, but not enough to seem inappropriately flashy. Her makeup was perfect, her hair styled in soft waves that looked effortless, but probably took hours to achieve. I'd worn my best dress, a navy blue one Daniel had bought me for Mother's Day last year. "This color brings out your eyes, Mom," he'd said when he gave it to me, along with matching earrings and a card that read, "Thank you for being my biggest supporter and my best friend." It felt appropriate, wearing something he'd chosen. I needed him close to me, even if it was just through a piece of fabric. The contrast between us was stark, and I'm sure it wasn't accidental. Cassandra looked like money, success, the kind of woman who belonged in this world of million-dollar estates and legal proceedings. I looked like what I was, a retired teacher from a middle-class background who'd never expected to be sitting in a room discussing her son's fortune. "Thank you all for coming," Lawrence began, adjusting his glasses. He was a kind man in his 60s who'd been Daniel's lawyer since the money started coming in, recommended by another influencer who'd needed help structuring his business affairs. "We're here to read the last will and testament of Daniel Marcus Thompson, dated March 15th of this year." March 15th. Daniel had died on July 3rd. The will was only a few months old, which meant he'd updated it after his marriage to Cassandra. This gave me a tiny spark of hope. Maybe he'd seen through her after all. Maybe he'd protected himself, and by extension, me. But Cassandra looked supremely confident, checking her phone discreetly and occasionally glancing at her lawyers with the kind of expression that suggested this was all a formality. She clearly expected good news. "Can we please expedite this?" she said, her voice carrying that slight whine it always had when she didn't get her way immediately. "I have a meeting with the Foundation Board at 3, and there are several urgent matters that need my attention." The Foundation Board, Daniel's charity, which she'd somehow managed to position herself as the head of, despite having zero experience in nonprofit work and even less genuine interest in mental health advocacy. It had happened so smoothly, so naturally, that by the time I realized what was occurring, she was already making decisions about funding allocations and program directions. "Of course we need to discuss the Foundation's future," one of her lawyers interjected. "Mrs. Thompson will be inheriting significant responsibilities along with significant assets, and she'll need guidance on how to manage them appropriately." I bit my tongue, literally bit it until I tasted copper, to keep from saying what I really thought about their assumptions regarding my capabilities. They were already talking about me like I was an elderly invalid who'd need their help to tie my shoes, let alone manage my son's estate. Lawrence nodded diplomatically. "Of course. Let me begin with the primary bequests." He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. The pages looked official and intimidating, covered in legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign alphabet. "To my beloved wife, Cassandra Marie Thompson, I leave my personal effects, including jewelry, clothing, and personal memorabilia, our joint bank accounts, and the house at 1247 Hillside Drive, along with its contents and furnishings." Cassandra's lips curved into what she probably thought was a sad smile, but it looked more like satisfaction to me. She glanced across the table at me, and I swear I saw triumph in her eyes. It was subtle, just a quick flash, but it was there. To my mother, Eleanor May Thompson, Lawrence continued, and my heart clenched at hearing my name spoken in connection with Daniel's will. The words seemed to echo in the quiet room, heavy with finality. I leave my heartfelt gratitude for a lifetime of love and support, and my hope that she will find peace in knowing how much she meant to me. That was it. That was the whole sentence. After 28 years of being Daniel's mother, after supporting his dreams, after being his biggest cheerleader and closest confidant, my inheritance was gratitude and hope. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the tick of the expensive clock on the wall, the distant hum of traffic from the street below, the barely audible whisper of the air conditioning. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't quite get enough air, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. Cassandra couldn't help herself. She actually smirked, a quick, satisfied expression that she tried to hide behind a tissue. "I told you, Eleanor," she said, using that patronizing tone she'd perfected during her brief marriage to my son. Her voice carried false sympathy, like she was delivering bad news that she secretly enjoyed sharing. "Daniel and I discussed this extensively before the accident. He felt that at your age, managing a large inheritance would be too stressful, too overwhelming. He was worried about your health, your ability to handle complex financial decisions." I stared at her, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest like a stone. "He said that?" "Oh yes," she continued, warming to her subject like a cat in sunlight. She leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured hands folded on the table. "He was very concerned about elderly people being taken advantage of by financial scams, identity theft, unscrupulous investment advisors. You know how these predators target seniors. He thought it was better this way, safer. He wanted you to be comfortable without the burden of responsibility." Each word felt like a small slap. The implication was clear. I was too old, too naive, too incompetent to handle my own son's legacy. "Besides," she added, with what she probably thought was kindness, "the house will probably need to be sold anyway. Daniel mentioned that the property taxes alone would be overwhelming for someone on a fixed income like yours. And the maintenance costs for a home that size, well, it's just not practical." One of her lawyers, a sharp-faced woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, leaned forward. "Mrs. Thompson, we'd be happy to help you find appropriate housing. There are some very nice senior communities in the area that would be perfect for someone in your situation. Assisted living facilities with meal programs, social activities, medical support on site. Someone in my situation. Someone old, alone, expendable, like I was already dead and just too stupid to realize it." The other lawyer, a younger man who kept checking his expensive watch, added, "We can also help coordinate the sale of any personal effects you might want to liquidate. I'm sure there are items of value that could provide additional financial security for your retirement years." They were already planning my future, already deciding how to parcel out the remnants of my life into manageable, senior-friendly pieces. They spoke about me like I wasn't even in the room, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person with feelings and opinions. But here's the thing about being 72 and having buried your only child. You don't have much left to lose. And when you don't have much left to lose, you stop caring about being polite. "Cassandra," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "you've known my son for exactly 10 months. I've known him for 28 years. If you think he would leave me with nothing but gratitude, then you didn't know him at all." Her smirk faltered slightly. "Eleanor, I understand you're emotional right now, but nothing." I turned to Lawrence. Is that really all he left me? Gratitude? Lawrence's expression was unreadable, but I caught something in his eyes, something that looked almost like anticipation. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, there's more. Daniel left specific instructions that I was not to reveal the full contents of his will until after the primary bequests were read and acknowledged." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cassandra's smirk disappeared entirely. "What do you mean, more?" she demanded. Lawrence reached into his folder again and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Daniel's familiar handwriting. My heart nearly stopped. Even in death, my boy was still taking care of me. Daniel left a letter specifically for his mother, to be read aloud in the presence of all beneficiaries. Lawrence looked directly at me. "Would you like me to read it, or would you prefer to read it yourself?" My hands were shaking too badly to hold anything steady. "Please, you read it." Lawrence carefully opened the envelope and unfolded what looked like several pages of Daniel's handwriting. He cleared his throat and began, "Mom, If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry for the pain you must be feeling. I know how much you worry about me, how much you've always protected me, and now I need you to know that I've been trying to protect you too." I felt tears starting, but I blinked them back. Daniel's voice seemed to fill the room through Lawrence's words, and I could almost see him sitting there, earnest and determined, writing these words with the same careful attention he'd always given to important things. "I need to tell you some things that I couldn't say while I was alive, things I discovered about Cassandra that broke my heart and opened my eyes to truths I didn't want to see. 3 weeks ago, I hired a private investigator to look into some financial irregularities I'd noticed with the foundation accounts. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. Cassandra had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup standing out starkly against her suddenly pale skin." Lawrence continued reading, his voice steady and clear. "She's been systematically stealing from my charity fund, Mom, not just taking a little here and there, but running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that's been going on for months. She's taken over $200,000 intended for therapy funding and used it for her personal expenses. Designer clothes, jewelry, that new car she claimed was for foundation business, even a down payment on a condo in Miami that she bought under her maiden name." The silence in the room was deafening. I looked across the table at Cassandra, who was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. "I have all the evidence, Mom. Bank records, receipts, credit card statements, even recordings of phone calls where she laughed about how easy it was to fool me. She called me pathetically trusting to her friends, said I was so focused on helping other people that I never paid attention to what was happening in my own house." One of Cassandra's lawyers was frantically typing on his phone, while the other was whispering urgently in her ear. But she wasn't responding, just staring at Lawrence like he was reading her death sentence. "But that's not the worst part," Lawrence continued reading. "I also found out that she's been planning to leave me almost from the moment we got married. She's been having an affair with Marcus Rivera, that fitness influencer with 3 million followers. They've been together for 4 months, not 2 weeks like I initially thought. They've been planning our divorce since before our honeymoon was over." Cassandra shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. "This is ridiculous. He was paranoid, depressed. He wasn't thinking clearly after the foundation stress." "Sit down," I said, and something in my voice made her comply immediately. There was a power in my words that surprised even me, the authority of a woman who had finally reached her limit. "Let him finish." Lawrence looked down at the letter again, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. "They've been meeting at her friend Jessica's apartment in West Hollywood, the one she claimed she was using for foundation planning meetings. I have security footage from the building, timestamps that correspond perfectly with her business meetings. They've been planning to wait until after our first wedding anniversary to file for divorce, because in California, that would entitle her to half of everything I've earned during our marriage." The legal implications hit the room like a bomb. Cassandra's lawyers were now both on their phones, clearly trying to figure out damage control. The private investigator also discovered that this isn't her first time running this kind of scheme. She was married before, briefly, to a tech entrepreneur in San Francisco. Similar pattern: whirlwind romance, expensive wedding, mysterious death of the husband in an accident, and a convenient inheritance. The husband's family suspected foul play, but could never prove anything. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just theft and adultery. This was a pattern. I confronted her about the theft 2 days ago, Mom. She didn't deny it. She laughed. She actually laughed and said I was too naive to understand how the real world worked. She said she deserved that money for putting up with my boring charity work and my clingy mother. Those were her exact words. That last part hit me like a physical blow. My clingy mother. Is that how she saw our relationship? The Sunday phone calls where we'd talk for hours about everything and nothing? The grocery runs where he'd insist on carrying all the heavy bags? The terrible puns we'd text back and forth that made us both laugh until we cried? The love that had sustained me through decades of being alone after his father died? She told me she was planning to take me for everything I was worth, and then she'd finally be free to live the life she deserved with Marcus. She said I was a means to an end, a stepping stone to the lifestyle she'd always wanted. But she made one crucial mistake, Mom. She underestimated how well I know you, and how much I learned from watching you survive and thrive after Dad died. I remembered those years after Daniel's father passed away from a heart attack when Daniel was only 12. I'd been devastated, lost, unsure how to be both mother and father to a grieving boy while dealing with my own overwhelming grief. But we'd survived together, Daniel and I, figuring out how to build a new kind of family, how to find joy again, how to honor the memory of the man we'd both loved while creating new traditions and new dreams. You taught me that real love protects the people you care about, even when they can't protect themselves. You taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is plan for the worst while hoping for the best. And you taught me that trust should be earned, not assumed. Lawrence paused, turning to the next page of the letter. The rustling of paper was the only sound in the room. So here's what she didn't know. Mom, I changed my will 3 days ago. Everything she thinks she's inherited, it's not real. The will that was just read is my old will. The one I wrote when I still believed I'd married someone who loved me for who I was, not for what I could give her. Cassandra's face had gone from pale to gray to green. She looked like she might actually be sick. What does that mean? What the hell does that mean? She whispered, but there was no fight left in her voice. Lawrence set down the letter and picked up another document, this one much thicker than the first will. It means, Mrs. Rivera. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say Rivera? I meant Mrs. Thompson. That the will I just read was Daniel's previous will, dated March 15th of this year. This, he held up the new document, is his actual final will, dated June 30th, just 3 days before his death. The implications hung in the air like smoke. June 30th, Daniel had changed his will just 3 days before he died. 3 days after confronting Cassandra about her theft and her affair. The two lawyers flanking Cassandra started whispering urgently to each other, their professional composure cracking as they realized their client's situation had just gone from advantageous to catastrophic. I saw one of them pulling out a phone, probably to call their malpractice insurance company. According to Daniel's final will, Lawrence continued, his voice taking on a formal tone that made each word feel like the pronouncement of a judge, all of his assets, including his business holdings, investment accounts, real estate properties, intellectual property rights, and the Daniel Thompson Foundation for Mental Health Access, are to be held in the Eleanor Thompson Trust, with Mrs. Thompson as the sole beneficiary and trustee. The words hit me like a wave. Everything. Daniel had left me everything. Not just the money, not just the house, but his entire legacy, his life's work, the foundation that meant more to him than any material possession. That's impossible, Cassandra screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. Her voice was shrill now, desperate, the mask of the grieving widow finally slipping to reveal the calculating predator underneath. I'm his wife. I have rights. You can't just disinherit a spouse. Actually, Lawrence said, with the calm satisfaction of a man who'd been preparing for this moment, you can. California law provides for spousal inheritance unless the deceased specifically disinherits their spouse in a properly executed will with clear evidence of intent. Daniel did exactly that. Furthermore, he included what's called a no-contest clause. If you challenge this will in any way, you forfeit even the personal effects he originally left you. Lawrence pulled out another document. Additionally, Daniel filed for divorce on June 29th, the day before he changed his will. The papers were never served because he died first, but the filing is legally valid and demonstrates his clear intent to end the marriage. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what was happening. My son, my sweet, quiet boy, had orchestrated this entire thing from beyond the grave. He'd planned this confrontation, this revelation, this moment of perfect justice. Even in death, he was still protecting me, still fighting for what was right. But Lawrence wasn't finished reading the letter. He turned to what appeared to be the final page, his expression growing even more serious. Mom, I know this is a lot to take in, but there's one more thing you need to know, and it's the most important part of this entire letter. The night before I died, Cassandra and I had a terrible fight about the will change. When I told her I knew about the theft, about Marcus, about everything, she became violent in a way I'd never seen before. The room fell dead silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. She threatened me, Mom, not just with divorce or public humiliation, but with physical harm. She said if I didn't change the will back and give her access to the foundation accounts, she'd make sure I regretted it. She said she'd find a way to make me pay for humiliating her, for ruining her plans. Those were her exact words, ruining her plans. I felt my blood turn to ice. This was what I'd suspected, what I'd feared, what everyone had told me was just grief-induced paranoia. She said she knew how to make things look like accidents. She told me about her first husband, the tech entrepreneur, and she laughed when she described how easy it had been to push him down the stairs when he caught her transferring money to offshore accounts. She called it poetic justice and said I was even easier to fool than he had been. Cassandra was completely white now, her breathing shallow and rapid. One of her lawyers was trying to get her attention, probably to tell her to stop talking, but she seemed to be in shock. I don't know what she's capable of, but I'm scared, Mom. Really scared. If something happens to me, please make sure the police see this letter. I've hidden copies in 3 different locations, and I've sent one to my friend Jake with instructions to open it if anything happens to me. I've also installed hidden security cameras throughout the house. Cameras that Cassandra doesn't know about, with footage that uploads automatically to a secure server. Lawrence paused, letting the implications sink in. There's more, Mrs. Thompson. Daniel included very specific instructions about evidence collection and law enforcement notification. I love you. I love... Mom, Lawrence continued reading. You gave me everything that mattered in life. Unconditional love, unwavering support, and the strength to keep going when everything seemed impossible. Now, I want to give you the security and peace you deserve. Take care of the foundation for me, but more importantly, take care of yourself. You're stronger than you know, and you're about to prove it. Use this money to help people, to continue the work we started together, and to live the life you deserve after spending so many years taking care of everyone else. My vision was blurring with tears now, but I forced myself to keep listening. And Mom, don't let anyone tell you that you're too old or too fragile to handle this responsibility. You raised a son who built an empire from nothing, who touched millions of lives, who never forgot where he came from, or who taught him how to love. You did that. Your love, your guidance, your example, if you could raise someone like me, you can handle anything the world throws at you. The letter concluded with, all my love, always and forever, Daniel. P.S. Tell Cassandra that karma is real, and it's coming for her with interest. The silence that followed was the kind that feels like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. I looked across the table at Cassandra, who was staring at Lawrence with the expression of someone who'd just watched their entire life implode in real time. Her careful composure was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine terror. You killed him, I said quietly. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement of fact. That's insane, she hissed. But her voice was shaking so badly she could barely get the words out. He fell down the stairs. It was an accident. I wasn't even there. He was 28 years old and in perfect health. He ran marathons for fun. Did yoga every morning? Had the reflexes of an athlete? You expect me to believe he just happened to fall down stairs he climbed every day? Stairs that weren't steep or poorly lit or dangerous in any way? People fall sometimes, she protested. But even she didn't sound convinced anymore. Lawrence cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson, Daniel also included very specific instructions regarding evidence he collected about both the charity theft and his concerns about his personal safety. Everything has been turned over to both the police and the district attorney's office. There's an investigation already underway, and Detective Morrison specifically asked me to inform him as soon as this will reading was complete. Cassandra's face went from white to green. I need to leave. Now. Right now. Actually, Lawrence said, reaching for his phone with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. I was instructed to call Detective Morrison as soon as this will reading was complete. Daniel wanted to make sure you'd be available for questioning about both the financial crimes and the circumstances surrounding his death. The next few minutes were a blur of Cassandra screaming about harassment and false accusations while her lawyers frantically made phone calls and tried to control the situation. But all I could think about was my son, planning this moment from beyond the grave, making sure his mother would be protected and his real legacy would survive. One of her lawyers was pulling at her arm, trying to get her to stop talking, but Cassandra seemed to have lost all self-control. This is ridiculous, she kept saying. You can't prove anything. It was an accident. People don't get murdered for changing their wills. Actually, I said, standing up slowly and feeling a strength I hadn't known I possessed. People get murdered for a lot less than millions of dollars and a ruined con game. And people certainly get murdered when they threaten to expose their killers to the police. Lawrence was on the phone now, speaking quietly to someone who was clearly law enforcement. I heard him saying things like, yes, the will reading is complete, and she's here now, and we'll wait for you to arrive. Cassandra tried to bolt for the door, but her lawyers blocked her path, probably realizing that running would look even worse than staying. She collapsed back into her chair, all the fight gone out of her. looking for the first time like what she really was, a predator who'd finally been caught. The security footage from Daniel's house, Lawrence said, hanging up the phone. The hidden cameras he mentioned in his letter, they caught everything that happened the night he died. Everything. And that's when Cassandra finally broke completely. The mask she'd worn for months, the grieving widow, the devastated partner, the woman who'd lost the love of her life, it all crumbled away to reveal the cold, calculating killer underneath. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she whispered, so quietly that we all had to strain to hear her. "He wasn't supposed to fight back. He wasn't supposed to be so strong." Her lawyers immediately started shouting at her to stop talking, but it was too late. The confession was out there, witnessed by everyone in the room. "He was going to ruin everything," she continued, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of rage and frustration. "I worked so hard, planned so carefully. He was supposed to be easy, like the others. But he had to be noble, had to be honest, had to protect his precious foundation and his clingy mother." The room fell silent, except for Cassandra's ragged breathing and the sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer. It took 6 weeks for the investigation to conclude. 6 weeks during which I learned things about my daughter-in-law that made me grateful Daniel had discovered the truth before it was too late. The affair with Marcus Rivera had been going on for 4 months, not 2. She'd stolen almost $300,000, not 200, and the security cameras Daniel had installed without telling her showed footage that made my blood run cold. The hidden cameras had captured everything. Cassandra arriving home that evening, not from a nail salon, but from Marcus Rivera's apartment. Daniel confronting her in their entryway about the divorce papers and the evidence of her crimes. The argument that escalated into violence when she realized her carefully laid plans were crumbling. And finally, the moment when she pushed my son down those marble stairs, then calmly waited 20 minutes before calling 911 to establish her timeline. The footage showed her staging the scene, messing up her hair and makeup, even deliberately staining her dress with Daniel's blood to look like she'd tried to help him. She'd been so confident in her performance, so sure she'd gotten away with the perfect crime. They arrested her on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming, and when faced with life in prison, even her high-powered legal team couldn't save her. She was eventually convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Marcus Rivera, her lover, received 10 years for conspiracy and money laundering, when it turned out he'd been helping her move the stolen foundation funds through fake endorsement deals and shell companies. The fitness influencer's empire crumbled overnight when his followers learned he'd been profiting from stolen charity money. 3 months after the trial ended, I was sitting in Daniel's office, my office now, in the beautiful house in the Hollywood Hills that I'd inherited along with everything else. The irony wasn't lost on me that at 72, I was finally learning how to run a business, manage millions of dollars, and navigate the world my son had built. It wasn't easy. There were days when the grief felt like it would crush me. When I missed his voice so badly, I'd call his phone just to hear his voicemail message. But there were also days when I felt his presence so strongly, it was like he was standing right beside me, watching me discover strengths I never knew I had. The foundation was thriving under my leadership. We'd not only recovered the stolen funds, but had expanded our programs dramatically. I'd hired a team of experienced nonprofit managers and mental health professionals, people who shared Daniel's vision and understood that helping others wasn't just charity, it was a calling. We now provided free therapy to over 15,000 people annually. We'd expanded Daniel's original vision to include programs for elder abuse prevention, financial literacy for seniors, and legal aid for people facing family-related financial fraud. Every time we helped someone who reminded me of my old self, someone who'd been made to feel small and unimportant, I felt Daniel's approval. The best part, though, was discovering that Daniel had been working on a new program just before he died. In his personal notes, I found detailed plans for support groups specifically designed for elderly people dealing with financial abuse from family members. He'd researched it extensively, recognizing that elder abuse was often invisible and unreported. "Mom always taught me to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves," he'd written in his notes. "Now I want to make sure she never has to feel vulnerable again." Even in death, my boy was still taking care of me. I kept his office exactly as he'd left it, with his awards and photos and the little succulent plant I'd given him for his birthday. Sometimes I'd sit at his desk and feel like he was guiding my hands as I signed checks and approved grants. The foundation's work had become my life's purpose, the thing that got me up every morning and gave meaning to my days. The money Daniel left me was more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. The house alone was worth $8 million, and that was just the beginning. But the real inheritance Daniel gave me wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd raised a son who loved me enough to protect me even after death, who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself, and who trusted me to carry on something bigger than both of us. Sometimes late at night, when I was working in his office, I swear I could hear him laughing. Not the polite laughter of someone trying to make others feel better, but the real, delighted laughter of someone who just witnessed perfect justice. "Got her, didn't we, Mom?" I could almost hear him saying. "Yes, sweetheart, we certainly did. I still wear that navy blue dress sometimes, the one he bought me for Mother's Day. But now I wear it to board meetings and press conferences and court dates. I wear it when I need to remember that love doesn't end with death, it just transforms into something more powerful." Daniel had been right about me being stronger than I knew. For years, I'd been the quiet mother, the one who stayed in the background while her son built his empire. I'd thought my role was to worry and support and fade quietly into the background of his success. But it turned out my son saw something in me that I'd never seen in myself. He saw a woman who could carry on his work, protect his legacy, and fight for justice when it mattered most. He saw someone who wouldn't back down when facing a woman 30 years younger who thought age meant weakness. I spent decades thinking my job was to fade gracefully into old age, to become smaller and quieter and less demanding. Instead, I discovered that 72 might just be the perfect age to stop caring what people think and start caring about what's right. Every Sunday, I still set the table for two out of habit. But now instead of feeling empty, it feels full of memories, full of purpose, full of the kind of love that doesn't end just because someone's not physically there to receive it, and strong enough to make sure that no one ever again underestimates what a 72-year-old mother is capable of when someone threatens her child's legacy. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. It took 6 weeks for the investigation to conclude. 6 weeks during which I learned things about my daughter-in-law that made me grateful Daniel had discovered the truth before it was too late. The affair with Marcus Rivera had been going on for 4 months, not 2. She'd stolen almost $300,000, not 200. And the security cameras Daniel had installed without telling her showed that on the day he died, she hadn't been getting her nails done. She'd been in the house, and the last footage of Daniel showed him alive and well, talking animatedly to someone off camera just 20 minutes before Cassandra found his body. They arrested her on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and suspected homicide. The murder case is still being built, but the financial crimes were ironclad. Daniel had documented everything meticulously, like he was building a case he knew he might not live to present. 3 months later, I was sitting in the office of Daniel's charity foundation, which I had renamed the Daniel Thompson Foundation for Mental Health and Justice. The irony wasn't lost on me that at 72, I was finally learning how to run a business, manage millions of dollars, and navigate the world my son had built. It wasn't easy. There were days when the grief felt like it would crush me. When I missed his voice so badly, I'd call his phone just to hear his voicemail message. But there were also days when I felt his presence so strongly, it was like he was standing right beside me, watching me discover strengths I never knew I had. The foundation was thriving. We'd not only recovered the stolen funds, but had expanded our programs to include legal aid for victims of domestic violence and financial fraud. It felt right, using Daniel's legacy to help people who'd been taken advantage of the way he was. I kept his house too, the one Cassandra had been so eager to claim. I moved out of my little apartment and into the beautiful home my son had built, surrounding myself with his memories and his dreams. His office became my office, and sometimes I'd sit at his desk and feel like he was guiding my hands as I signed checks and approved grants. The best part, though, was discovering that Daniel had been planning to propose a new program just before he died. He'd wanted to create support groups for elderly people dealing with financial abuse from family members. He'd researched it extensively, recognizing that elder abuse was often invisible and unreported. "Mom always taught me to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves," he'd written in his notes. "Now I want to make sure she never has to feel vulnerable again." Even in death, my boy was still taking care of me. Cassandra was eventually convicted of embezzlement and fraud. The murder charges were harder to prove without a witness, but she got 15 years for the financial crimes. Marcus Rivera, her lover, had his assets frozen when it turned out he'd been helping her launder the stolen money through fake endorsement deals. The day the verdict came down, I sat in my son's beautiful kitchen and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt since the day he died: peace. Daniel had been right about me being stronger than I knew. For years, I'd been the quiet mother, the one who stayed in the background while her son built his empire. I'd thought my role was to worry and support and fade quietly into the background of his success. But it turned out my son saw something in me that I'd never seen in myself. He saw a woman who could carry on his work, protect his legacy, and fight for justice when it mattered most. He saw someone who wouldn't back down when facing a woman 30 years younger who thought age meant weakness. I spent decades thinking my job was to fade gracefully into old age, to become smaller and quieter and less demanding. Instead, I discovered that 72 might just be the perfect age to stop caring what people think and start caring about what's right. The foundation now helps over 10,000 people annually. We've expanded Daniel's original vision to include programs for elder abuse prevention, financial literacy for seniors, and legal aid for people facing family-related financial fraud. Every time we help someone who reminds me of my old self, someone who's been made to feel small and unimportant, I feel Daniel's approval. Sometimes late at night, when I'm working in his office, I swear I can hear him laughing. Not the polite laughter of someone trying to make others feel better, but the real delighted laughter of someone who's just witnessed perfect justice. "Got her, didn't we, Mom?" I can almost hear him saying. "Yes, sweetheart, we certainly did. I still wear that navy blue dress sometimes, the one he bought me for Mother's Day. But now I wear it to board meetings and press conferences and court dates. I wear it when I need to remember that love doesn't end with death. It just transforms into something more powerful." Cassandra sent me a letter from prison last month. She wanted to apologize and ask for my forgiveness, and wondered if there was any way the foundation might help with her legal fees for her appeal. I read it twice, showed it to my lawyer, and then did something that would have made Daniel very proud. I sent her a sympathy card, the kind you send when someone dies. Inside, I wrote, "So sorry for your loss. With deepest condolences on the death of your credibility, your freedom, and your scheme. May you rest in peace, Eleanor." Perhaps that was petty, but at 72, having buried my only child and discovered my own strength in the process, I figure I've earned the right to a little pettiness. The money Daniel left me is more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. The foundation will continue long after I'm gone, helping people who need advocates, people who need someone to believe in them when their own families have let them down. But the real inheritance Daniel gave me wasn't money. It was the knowledge that I raised a son who loved me enough to protect me even after death, who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself, and who trusted me to carry on something bigger than both of us. Every Sunday, I still set the table for two out of habit. But now, instead of feeling empty, it feels full of memories, full of purpose, full of the kind of love that doesn't end just because someone's not physically there to receive it. Daniel was right about one thing. I am stronger than I knew. Strong enough to run a multi-million-dollar foundation, strong enough to face down a killer in a conference room, strong enough to turn grief into justice and pain into purpose, and strong enough to make sure that no one ever again underestimates what a 72-year-old mother is capable of when someone threatens her child's legacy. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. When red wine exploded across my $50,000 rental gown, I smiled at my daughter-in-law and calmly told her she'd just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. I walked out of that wedding reception with wine dripping from my designer beadwork, and by the time I reached my car, I'd already decided to destroy her family's empire. 3 months later, she'd learn exactly what happens when you humiliate a woman who spent 30 years as a forensic accountant. If you're watching this story, let me know in the comments where you're from and what you think you'd do in my situation. This gets wild, and I promise you won't see the ending coming. But let me back up and tell you how we got to that moment, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. The whole disaster started 6 months earlier when my son David announced his engagement to Vanessa Ashford. I should have known right then that trouble was brewing. Not because she wasn't lovely, she was absolutely stunning in that perfectly polished way that money can buy, but because of how she looked at me during that first family dinner, like I was a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the decor. "Mom, Vanessa's family owns Ashford Industries," David had said. His chest puffed with pride. "You know, the shipping company?" I knew Ashford Industries all right. Any accountant worth her salt knew them. Multi-billion-dollar empire, fingers in everything from logistics to real estate. Old money, the kind that builds dynasties and buys politicians. The wedding planning was a nightmare from day one. Vanessa had ideas, all of them expensive and most of them designed to remind everyone exactly which family was footing the bill. The venue had to be the Ritz-Carlton. The flowers had to be imported from Belgium. The photographer had to be some celebrity artist who charged more per hour than most people made in a month. The dress was Vanessa's idea, too. "You simply must wear something spectacular, Margaret. Divine and $50,000 for a rental." I nearly choked when I saw the price tag, but Vanessa just waved it away. "Consider it our gift to you. You're going to be family after all." The wedding day dawned perfect. The ceremony was at the family estate with 300 of their closest friends. I counted maybe 20 people from our side, lost in a sea of society faces I recognized from newspaper columns. During the reception, I was making small talk when it happened. I was holding a glass of water, gesturing while telling a story about David's childhood, when a single drop fell from my glass onto the hem of Vanessa's dress. One drop. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." I'd immediately grabbed my napkin, reaching to blot the barely visible spot. That's when Vanessa's face changed. For just a split second, I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. Then she gasped, stepped backward, and somehow, though I swear she did it on purpose, her wine glass tipped over, sending a full glass of red wine cascading down the front of my dress. "Oh no!" she cried, her hand flying to her mouth in mock horror. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I'm so clumsy when I'm startled." The entire reception turned to stare. I stood there, wine dripping from the intricate beadwork, creating an ever-expanding stain across the silk. "It was an accident," Vanessa said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Just like yours was, of course." But I'd seen that look in her eyes. This hadn't been an accident. This had been a power play, a deliberate humiliation designed to put me in my place. That's when I smiled and delivered my promise. "Don't worry about it, darling," I told Vanessa, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned reception. "Accidents happen. Though I have to say, the rental company is going to be very upset about this. $50,000 is a lot of money, even for an accident." I left through the garden exit, my dignity intact despite the wine stains. But as I sat in my car, hands shaking with rage and humiliation, I realized something important. Vanessa Ashford had just made a critical error. She'd assumed I was some harmless older woman she could dismiss and humiliate without consequences. She had no idea who she was dealing with. 3 days after the wedding, the rental company's bill arrived. $57,000 for a destroyed designer gown. Irreparable damage due to liquid staining. I stared at the invoice over my morning coffee, and something inside me shifted from hurt to resolve. I paid it without blinking. Then I did something Vanessa would never expect from a harmless older woman. I started digging. 30 years as a forensic accountant teaches you one fundamental truth. Everyone has secrets, and rich people have the most expensive ones. I'd built my career unraveling financial mysteries, following paper trails that led to embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion. I knew how to look where others couldn't see. My first stop was my home office, where I'd kept every professional contact I'd ever made. I started with the basics: corporate filings, SEC reports, anything public that might give me insight into Ashford Industries. On the surface, everything looked pristine. Annual revenues in the billions, steady growth, glowing reports from financial analysts. But I'd learned long ago that the surface was where people painted their prettiest lies. "Margaret, you're scaring me," my friend Linda said when I called her at the accounting firm where she still worked. "Why are you suddenly interested in Ashford Industries?" Let's just say I have a personal interest in understanding their business practices, I replied, scrolling through incorporation documents. Can you still access those federal databases we used to use? That evening, David called. I could hear the strain in his voice before he even spoke. Mom, Vanessa's really upset about the dress thing. She feels terrible about the accident. I set down my teacup with deliberate precision. I'm sure she does. The thing is, her father wants to pay for the cleaning bill, make things right. How generous of him. Tell Mr. Ashford the bill was $57,000 and I've already paid it. The silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. 57,000? Mom, that can't be right. I have the receipt if you'd like to see it. I kept my voice level. It was quite the educational experience, learning about the insurance requirements for couture rentals. Jesus, Mom, I had no idea. Vanessa said it was just a regular dress. Interesting. So the new Mrs. Turner had been feeding her husband lies already. Well, now you know. Consider it a wedding gift to your bride, a lesson in the cost of actions. That's not fair. It was an accident. The words hung between us like a challenge. I could tell him what I'd seen in his wife's eyes, the calculated coldness before she spilled that wine. But David was still in the honeymoon phase. Of course it was, dear. I'm sure Vanessa would never deliberately humiliate someone, especially not at her own wedding. My son wasn't stupid. He heard the edge in my voice. Mom, please don't make this into something it's not. I'm not making it into anything, David, but I am learning some very interesting things about your new family. After I hung up, I stared at the financial documents scattered across my desk. Ashford Industries was massive, complex, with tentacles reaching into dozens of subsidiary companies. But complexity often masked simplicity, and in my experience, when rich people created complex structures, they were usually hiding something simple: theft. I'd found 3 discrepancies already. Shell companies that received large payments but had no apparent business purpose. Shipping routes that didn't match cargo manifests. International transfers that seemed designed to avoid certain reporting requirements. It was like finding a thread sticking out of an expensive sweater. You could ignore it, or you could pull it and see what unraveled. I reached for my phone and dialed Linda's number again. It's me, I said when she answered. How would you feel about doing a little freelance work? The paying kind? Margaret, what are you getting yourself into? I looked at the wine-stained dress hanging in my closet, the $57,000 reminder of my new daughter-in-law's accident. Something I should have done years ago, I said. I'm going to find out exactly how the Ashford family really makes their money. 2 weeks into my investigation, I found the first real smoking gun buried in a subsidiary company's tax filings from 2019. Ashford Maritime Solutions had reported moving cargo worth $12 million through the Port of Charleston, but the customs declarations I managed to track down showed only $8 million in declared value. $4 million in merchandise that somehow disappeared between the shipping manifests and the tax returns. This is just one port, 1 year, I told Linda, as we sat in my kitchen, documents spread across the table like pieces of a very expensive puzzle. If they're doing this systematically, Linda whistled low. We're talking about tens of millions in unreported income, maybe more. My phone rang, David's ringtone. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered on the 4th ring. Hi, sweetheart. Mom, we need to talk. Vanessa's father wants to meet with you. I felt my pulse quicken. About what? He feels bad about the whole dress situation. He wants to take you to lunch? Maybe discuss some business opportunities. Business opportunities. How interesting. What kind of business opportunities? He knows you're a retired accountant. He mentioned something about consulting work, helping with some project assessments. I looked at the evidence scattered across my table and smiled grimly. Oh, I'd love to assess some of their projects. The next day at Romano's, Richard Ashford was already seated when I arrived. He stood to greet me, tall and distinguished with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that came from never being told no. Margaret, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. His handshake was firm, his voice warm. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of ordering wine. The 2015 Bordeaux here is exceptional. Wine? Of course. How thoughtful, I said, settling into my chair. Though I think I'll stick with water for now. His smile flickered slightly. Of course. I wanted to apologize again for the incident at the wedding. Vanessa was mortified. I'm sure she was. I kept my expression neutral. Accidents do happen. They do indeed. Which is why I insist on covering the cost of the damage. I watched his face carefully. The dress cost exactly what I paid for it. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of calculation. $57,000 seems quite steep for a rental, don't you think? Interesting. So he'd already done his homework. I suppose that depends on whether you consider it steep to maintain one's dignity in front of 300 strangers. He leaned back slightly, reassessing. Good. Let him realize I wasn't some easily intimidated widow. You're absolutely right. Please allow me to reimburse you for the full amount. That's very generous, but unnecessary. I can afford my own expenses. I'm sure you can. David mentioned you had quite a successful career in accounting. The waiter appeared, giving me a moment to consider my response. When we were alone again, I decided to test the waters. I did all right. Forensic accounting mostly. Corporate investigations, that sort of thing. I watched his face carefully for any reaction to the word investigations. There it was, a subtle tightening around his eyes, quickly masked. How fascinating. That must have been challenging work. It had its moments. You'd be amazed what you can discover when you know where to look. Paper trails have a way of revealing the most interesting stories. Richard took a sip of his wine, his movements carefully controlled. I imagine they do. Actually, that brings me to why I wanted to meet with you today. We're always looking for experienced consultants at Ashford Industries. There it was. The job offer. Classic move: if you can't neutralize a threat, try to buy it. What kind of consulting? I asked innocently. Project assessment, due diligence, that sort of thing. We're expanding into some new markets, and having an experienced eye review our processes could be invaluable. I smiled. That sounds wonderful. I'd love to learn more about your business practices. Richard Ashford wasn't trying to buy my silence with a consulting job. He was positioning me to become complicit in whatever schemes I'd been uncovering. If I took this job, I wouldn't just be a witness. I'd be an accessory. It was brilliant, really. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I needed their money more than I needed the truth. I accepted Richard Ashford's consulting offer with the enthusiasm of a woman grateful for the opportunity. We shook hands across the table at Romano's, and I watched satisfaction settle into his features. I'll have my assistant send over the initial contracts and some preliminary materials for you to review, he said. Nothing too complex to start, just some basic due diligence on a few subsidiary operations. I look forward to it, I replied, and meant every word. 3 days later, a courier delivered a package to my door. Inside were contracts, corporate documents, and, most interesting of all, financial records for 6 different Ashford subsidiary companies. Richard had basically handed me a roadmap to their entire operation. You took the job? Linda's voice pitched high with disbelief when I called her. Margaret, have you lost your mind? On the contrary, I think I've found it. I was already scanning through shipping manifests. They've just given me legal access to exactly the information I need to build a case against them. A case you're now contractually obligated to keep confidential. I paused in my document review. Actually, no. The confidentiality clause only applies to proprietary business information. It specifically excludes any obligation to conceal illegal activities. That evening, David called just as I was discovering some particularly creative accounting in the records for Ashford Maritime Solutions. Mom, Vanessa told me her father offered you a consulting position. That's great news. It's certainly interesting work, I agreed, highlighting a transaction that showed the same cargo being reported to 2 different tax jurisdictions at wildly different values. Vanessa thought maybe we could all have dinner this weekend to celebrate. That sounds lovely. Dear, though I should warn you, I might have some questions about the family business. Mom, David's voice carried a warning. I hope you're not planning to cause any trouble. The words hit me like a slap. Trouble? David, I'm doing the job your wife's father offered me. If that causes trouble, perhaps you should ask yourself why. By midnight, I'd identified a pattern that made my blood run cold. The discrepancies weren't random accounting errors. They were systematic, sophisticated, and pointed to something much larger than I'd initially suspected. Ashford Industries wasn't just hiding income from the IRS. They were moving money in patterns that suggested money laundering on an international scale. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands received payments from cargo that was declared at one value to U.S. Customs, but sold at much higher prices to end buyers. I sat back in my chair, the magnitude of what I'd discovered settling over me. This wasn't just about tax evasion anymore. This was about a family that had built their empire on systematic criminal activity. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Looking forward to dinner Saturday. Vanessa's excited to see you." I stared at the message, thinking about my son's naive enthusiasm, his beautiful criminal wife, and the family of felons he'd just married into. David had no idea what he'd stumbled into, but he would listen to evidence. He would have to. I picked up my pen and began making notes for my report. If the Ashfords wanted a consultant's professional opinion on their business practices, I was going to give them exactly what they'd asked for. And when I was finished, David would finally understand why his new family had been so eager to welcome him into their world. The real question was whether he'd choose truth over comfort when the moment came. Saturday dinner at David and Vanessa's new house was a masterclass in performance art. Their home was a wedding gift from Daddy, a colonial revival worth at least $4 million, complete with circular driveway and professionally landscaped gardens. "Isn't it gorgeous?" Vanessa gushed as she led me through rooms that looked like they'd been staged for a magazine shoot. Daddy insisted on hiring his decorator. I made appropriately appreciative noises while mentally calculating the property value. Conservative estimate. More money than David could earn in 50 years of marketing work. David appeared from the wine cellar, carrying a bottle that probably cost more than most people's car payments. "Mom, you have to try this. It's from the same vineyard where we stayed on our honeymoon." I accepted the glass, noting the vintage. 2005, Brunello di Montalcino, $1,500 a bottle. "It's lovely," I said, taking a small sip. "Though I have to ask, David, how exactly are you affording all this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Vanessa's smile flickered, and David shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Vanessa's family has been very generous." "Generous how?" I kept my voice light. "Gifts? Loans? Employment opportunities?" "Mom," David's voice carried that warning tone again, "we're doing fine financially." Before either of them could answer, my phone chimed with an email notification. It was from my contact at the Treasury Department, a former colleague who owed me several favors. "Margaret, found what you were looking for. Ashford Industries flagged for suspicious activity reports in 2019 and 2021. Investigation pending, but low priority due to lack of evidence. Might be more interested now if someone had specific documentation. Call me." "Sarah, everything all right?" David asked. "Just work stuff," I said, slipping the phone back into my purse. "Actually," Vanessa said brightly, "Daddy mentioned that you're working on some projects for us now." "How exciting." The way she said it made me look at her more carefully. There was something in her expression, a calculation that reminded me of the moment before she spilled wine on my dress. "It's fascinating work," I agreed. "Your father's business model is quite innovative." "He's brilliant," Vanessa gushed, "always finding new opportunities, new markets to explore. He says the key to success is staying ahead of regulations." Staying ahead of regulations. That was certainly one way to put it. It wasn't until dessert that Vanessa dropped her first real clue about what they actually knew. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you found everything you need in the materials Daddy gave you?" The question was casual, but her eyes were sharp. "I'm making good progress," I replied carefully. "Though some of the subsidiary structures are quite complex, I might need to dig deeper into the international operations." David and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance, so fast I almost missed it. "I'm sure Daddy would be happy to provide additional documentation," Vanessa said. "He's very committed to transparency." Transparency. From a family running what appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. "That would be helpful," I said, "especially the customs declarations for the Caribbean routes. Some of the cargo values seem inconsistent." This time, the glance between them was unmistakable. Vanessa's smile became fixed, and David reached for his wine glass with slightly too much focus. "Which charities are you involved with?" I asked, changing direction. "Oh, several. The Maritime Heritage Foundation, the International Trade Education Society, the Caribbean Development Initiative." Each name hit me like a small shock. I'd seen those organizations in the financial records. They were all recipients of significant donations from Ashford Industries. As I drove home that night, I realized the dinner had been a test. They'd wanted to see how much I knew, how much I suspected, how much of a threat I might pose. By asking about the Caribbean roots, by showing interest in the charities, I'd revealed that I was looking at exactly the areas where their most damaging secrets were hidden. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Unknown number. Mrs. Turner, this is Patricia Webb from Ashford Industries. Mr. Ashford asked me to call you about your consulting contract. I felt my stomach tighten. What about it? There's been a change in scope for the initial project. Mr. Ashford would like to schedule a meeting with you first thing Monday morning to discuss the revised parameters. They were about to try to limit my access to the very information I needed. The Ashfords thought they were playing chess with an amateur. They were about to discover they'd invited a grandmaster to the board. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray December drizzle that made everything look like a crime scene. The Ashford Industries building was a monument to corporate success. 30 stories of glass and steel that dominated the downtown skyline. Mr. Ashford will see you now, Patricia Webb announced, leading me through corridors lined with oil paintings that probably cost more than most people's houses. Richard's office occupied a corner of the 28th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the harbor, where his shipping empire had allegedly been moving millions of dollars in undeclared cargo. Margaret, thank you for coming in. He rose from behind a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier. Please, sit down. I wanted to discuss your project scope, he began, sliding a manila folder across the desk. I opened the folder to find a revised contract that made my blood run cold. Where the original agreement had given me access to subsidiary financial records, shipping manifests, and international transaction data, this new version limited my review to domestic operational efficiency protocols. In other words, they wanted me to analyze office supplies while staying far away from anything that might reveal actual crimes. This is quite a change, I said carefully. We realized the initial scope was perhaps too ambitious. Starting smaller will allow you to get familiar with our systems. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired his skill. I see. And if I were to continue with my current analysis of the international shipping protocols, would that be a problem? The question hung between us like a blade. Richard leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his mask slipped just enough to show me the steel underneath. Margaret, I think there might be some confusion about your role here. You're a consultant, not an auditor. Of course, though in my experience the two often go hand in hand. Not in this case. His voice carried a note of finality. The revised contract clearly outlines your responsibilities. I looked down at the contract again, reading the subtle legal language that would effectively muzzle me. If I signed this, I'd be locked into a consulting role that gave me access to nothing useful while creating a paper trail that showed I'd reviewed and approved their operations. Classic corporate whitewashing. It was brilliant, and it would have worked perfectly if they'd been dealing with someone who actually needed the money. This is very generous, I said, closing the folder, but I'm afraid I can't accept these terms. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. I beg your pardon? The scope is too limited to provide you with meaningful value. If you're not interested in a comprehensive analysis, I don't think I'm the right consultant for this project. The silence stretched between us while Richard recalculated. This clearly wasn't the response he'd expected. Margaret, I hope you're not making this decision lightly. Opportunities like this don't come along often. There it was, the implicit threat. Play ball or lose access to the game entirely. I understand completely, I replied. But my professional reputation is built on providing thorough, comprehensive analysis. Richard stood up, moving to the window with his back to me. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. I think you should consider your position carefully, Margaret. Family relationships can be delicate, especially when outside conflicts create unnecessary stress. Translation: if you don't back down, we'll turn your son against you. I stood up too, slinging my purse over my shoulder with deliberate calm. Mr. Ashford, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what kind of person you're dealing with. He turned from the window, his expression guarded. You see, I continued, you've made the mistake of assuming I need something from you. your money, your approval, your family's acceptance. But the truth is, I don't need any of those things. What I need is the truth, and I'm very good at finding it. Richard's face had gone completely cold now. Be very careful. Margaret, you're playing in a league you don't understand. I smiled, the same smile I'd given his daughter-in-law after she destroyed my dress. Mr. Ashford, I've spent 30 years unraveling financial crimes that were far more sophisticated than anything your family has managed. You're not playing in a league I don't understand. You're playing a game I helped invent. I walked to the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. Oh, and Richard, that wine your daughter spilled on my dress? I kept the receipts. Funny thing about evidence, it has a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times. I left him standing in his pristine office. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, my phone was already ringing. Sarah from Treasury. Margaret, I just got your message about the Ashford documentation. How soon can you get it to me? I stepped out into the December drizzle, feeling the electric thrill of a hunt about to reach its conclusion. How about this afternoon? I said. I think it's time the Treasury Department learned exactly how the Ashford family has been staying ahead of regulations. The game was about to change completely, and this time, I was holding all the cards. Sarah from Treasury met me at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where government employees could blend in with students and freelancers. She looked exactly like I remembered. Sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the demeanor of someone who'd spent 20 years following money trails. Margaret, you beautiful genius, she said, flipping through the documents I'd brought. This is a prosecutor's dream. You've connected transactions across 17 different subsidiary companies. 23? Actually, I found 6 more over the weekend. I sipped my coffee, watching her face light up. The Caribbean routes alone show nearly $40 million in unreported income over 3 years. Sarah whistled low. And you got all this from their own internal records? Richard Ashford hand-delivered it to my house. Signed, sealed, and legally obtained through a consulting contract that gives me explicit permission to review their financial operations. What about the confidentiality clause? I smiled. Read paragraph 7, subsection C. The confidentiality obligation specifically excludes any requirement to conceal illegal activities. Richard's lawyers were so confident they built their own loophole. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. These people really thought they were untouchable, didn't they? For 30 years, they've been right. I pulled out another folder. But here's where it gets interesting. The money laundering operation isn't Richard's brainchild. It's a family business that goes back to his father. I showed her the historical records I dug up, incorporation documents and tax filings that revealed a pattern spanning 3 decades. The Ashfords have been using their legitimate shipping business to move dirty money since the 1990s. Drugs, arms dealing, human trafficking. They don't care what they're laundering as long as the price is right. Sarah's expression grew grim. How much are we talking about total? Conservative estimate? $200 million in unreported income. If we factor in the money they've laundered for other criminal organizations, we're looking at transactions totaling over $1 billion. She closed the folders, her mind clearly racing. Margaret, you realize what you've just handed me? This isn't just tax evasion anymore. This is RICO territory. We're talking about dismantling an entire criminal empire. Good, I said simply. They earned it. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Mom, can you call me? Something's happened. I called David back as I walked to my car. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with panic. Mom, where are you? Downtown. What's wrong? I just got a call from Vanessa. She said her father had a meeting with you this morning. And now there are federal agents asking questions at their office. I felt a thrill of satisfaction. Sarah hadn't wasted any time. Federal agents asking what kind of questions? About financial records, shipping manifests, international transactions. Mom, please tell me you didn't do anything stupid. Stupid. That was an interesting choice of words from someone who'd married into a crime family. David, I did exactly what Vanessa's father hired me to do. I analyzed his business practices and provided my professional assessment. To the FBI? To the appropriate authorities, yes. Jesus Christ, Mom. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've exposed a criminal organization that's been stealing from the American people for 30 years. I'd say that's a pretty good day's work. They're family now. Vanessa is my wife. And Richard Ashford is a criminal who's been using his legitimate business to launder money for drug dealers and arms dealers. Your wife is a beneficiary of blood money, David. Even if that's true, why couldn't you just walk away? Why did you have to destroy everything? Because they humiliated me at your wedding. And when I tried to handle it quietly, they tried to buy my silence. And when that didn't work, they threatened to turn you against me, which, apparently, they've succeeded in doing. This isn't about choosing sides, isn't it? I interrupted. Because it sounds like you've already chosen, and it's not your mother. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with rage and heartbreak. By evening, the story had broken on the local news. Federal investigation targets major shipping company. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled in to watch my handiwork unfold on television. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like war. The next morning brought 3 phone calls that changed everything. The first was from my lawyer, warning me that the Ashfords had hired the most expensive criminal defense team on the East Coast. The second was from Sarah, telling me that Richard Ashford had been arrested at his home at 6 a.m. The third was from David, and his voice was completely different from the day before. "Mom, I need to see you. Can I come over?" Of course. When he arrived an hour later, he looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his clothes looked like he'd slept in them. "They arrested Richard this morning," he said, slumping into my kitchen chair. "Vanessa's completely falling apart." I poured him coffee, noting the way his hands shook. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know. I can't process any of this." He looked up at me with haunted eyes. "Mom, is it really as bad as they're saying on the news?" "What are they saying?" "Money laundering, tax evasion, RICO charges. They're talking about criminal conspiracy going back decades." "All of that appears to be accurate, yes." David put his head in his hands. How did I not see it? How did I marry into this and not have any idea what they were doing? For the first time since this all began, I felt genuine sympathy for my son. Because they're very good at hiding it, and because you had no reason to look for it. But you did. I thought about how to answer that. I started looking because Vanessa humiliated me, and I wanted to know who I was dealing with. I kept looking because what I found was too serious to ignore. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. "What's going to happen to Vanessa?" "I don't know. That depends on how involved she was in the actual operations." "She wasn't involved. She doesn't know anything about the business side." I pulled out one of the files I'd given to Treasury, the charity donation records. "David, look at this." He reluctantly took the papers, scanning the highlighted entries. The Maritime Heritage Foundation received $3 million from Ashford Industries last year, I explained. The International Trade Education Society got $2.5 million. The Caribbean Development Initiative got $4 million. So, they're generous with charity donations. All 3 organizations are run by Vanessa. She's the president of Maritime Heritage, the executive director of Trade Education, and the founder of Caribbean Development. David stared at the papers, the implications slowly sinking in. "David, these aren't real charities. They're shell organizations designed to create tax deductions while funneling money through the Caribbean banking system. Vanessa has been running 3 separate money laundering operations disguised as humanitarian work." The color drained from his face. "That can't be right. Look at the expense reports. Maritime Heritage spent $60,000 on office supplies last month, but has no office. Trade Education paid $800,000 for educational materials to a company that doesn't exist." My son stared at the evidence, and I could see the moment when denial cracked and reality flooded in. "She lied to me," he whispered, "about everything. I'm sorry, sweetheart." "No, you're not." His voice was bitter. "You're happy about this. You get to be right about her." The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it, but only a grain. "I'm not happy that you're hurt," I said quietly. "But I'm not sorry that the truth came out." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "What am I supposed to do now? My wife is about to be arrested. My house is owned by criminals. Everything I thought I knew about my life is a lie. You start over. You separate yourself from their crimes legally and financially. And you decide what kind of man you want to be going forward." He turned from the window, his expression desperate. "Can you help me?" "Of course I can," I said. "But first, you need to answer a question honestly. Did you know anything about their business practices? Anything at all? David met my eyes, and I saw my son, really saw him, for the first time in months. No, he said quietly. I swear to you, I had no idea. I believed him. Despite everything, I still loved him. And that was enough to start rebuilding what Vanessa Ashford had nearly destroyed. Then we'll figure this out together, I said. But you might need to testify against your wife. Vanessa's counterattack came exactly 72 hours after her father's arrest, delivered by a lawyer who looked like he charged $1,000 just to answer his phone. Mrs. Turner, my client has some concerns about your recent actions, he said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table with practiced confidence. Marcus Blackwood was old-school Boston establishment, Harvard law, expensive suits, and the kind of political connections that could make problems disappear. If the Ashfords had hired him, they were playing for keeps. I'm sure she does, I replied, pouring myself tea with deliberate calm. Would you like some coffee, Mr. Blackwood? This isn't a social call. He opened his briefcase with surgical precision. My client believes you've acted in bad faith regarding your consulting agreement with Ashford Industries. How so? You used your position of trust to gather information for the specific purpose of damaging the family business. That constitutes corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and possibly criminal conspiracy. I sipped my tea, letting him finish his speech. Marcus Blackwood was good, very good. Under different circumstances, I might have been intimidated. Mr. Blackwood, have you actually read the consulting contract? Of course. Then you know that paragraph 7, subsection C, specifically excludes any obligation to conceal illegal activities. Your client's father signed a contract that gave me explicit permission to report exactly what I reported. His confident expression flickered slightly. The contract was signed under false pretenses. Did I? Because as I recall, Richard Ashford offered me the position after I'd already asked pointed questions about shipping discrepancies and customs declarations. If he chose to hire someone who was asking the right questions, that suggests either remarkable stupidity or remarkable arrogance. My client was 19 when these alleged activities began. Your client was running 3 separate money laundering operations disguised as charities, I interrupted. The youngest shell company was incorporated when she was 25. Try again. Blackwood's jaw tightened. Those were legitimate charitable organizations. I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Caribbean Development Initiative donated $2 million for hurricane relief to St. Lucia in 2023. St. Lucia didn't have any hurricanes in 2023. The money went to a bank account in Grand Cayman, controlled by Vanessa's offshore trust. He didn't touch the folder. Charitable organizations can make grants. The Maritime Heritage Foundation spent $800,000 on a maritime education program for disadvantaged youth. The program doesn't exist. The money went to pay for Vanessa's house, her cars, and what appears to be a very expensive jewelry collection. These are accounting errors, at worst. Mr. Blackwood. I leaned forward, letting steel creep into my voice. I've been tracking financial crimes for 30 years. I know the difference between accounting errors and systematic fraud. Your client didn't just know about her family's criminal activities. She was an active participant. For the first time since he'd arrived, Marcus Blackwood looked genuinely concerned. What do you want? He asked finally. I want the truth. I want justice. And I want my son to understand exactly what kind of woman he married. Your son doesn't have to be involved in this. I almost laughed at the transparent manipulation. My son is already involved. He's married to your client, he's living in a house bought with criminal proceeds, and he's been unknowingly benefiting from money laundering operations for months. We can protect him. From what? From the truth? Blackwood shifted tactics. Mrs. Turner, you're a mother. Surely you understand the importance of family loyalty. Vanessa is your daughter-in-law now. She became part of my family when she threw wine on my dress to humiliate me in front of 300 people. Everything that's happened since then has been a direct result of that choice. This is about revenge. This is about consequences. Vanessa thought she could treat me like garbage because I was just some middle-class nobody who didn't matter. She was wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from David. FBI wants to interview me tomorrow. Can you be there? I showed Blackwood the message. It looks like your client's husband is ready to cooperate with federal authorities. I'd suggest you advise her to do the same. Blackwood stood up, snapping his briefcase shut with barely controlled frustration. "This isn't over, Mrs. Turner." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "It's not over. It's just getting started." After he left, I called Sarah to give her a heads up about the legal maneuvering. "They're going to try to paint you as a vindictive mother-in-law," she warned. "Let them try. I have 30 years of professional credibility and a paper trail that shows exactly how I obtained the evidence." "What about your son?" I looked out at my garden. Roses and lavender that had taken years to establish but now bloomed beautifully with proper care. "My son is going to learn that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do," I said. The Ashfords were about to discover that good men could be very dangerous when they finally decided to stop being naive. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Vanessa herself, in a moment of breathtaking stupidity that would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so perfectly predictable. David called me at 7 in the morning, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Mom, I need you to come over right now. And Mom, you were right about everything." I arrived at David's house to find FBI agents loading boxes into unmarked vans, while neighbors clustered on sidewalks, whispering behind their hands. David met me at the door, his face gray with exhaustion and shock. "They arrested Vanessa an hour ago," he said without preamble. "But that's not the worst part." He led me to his home office, where Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI was waiting with files spread across his desk. "Mrs. Turner," Agent Chen nodded. "Yeah. Thank you for coming. We have a situation that I think you'll find interesting." She gestured to bank statements and wire transfer records. "Your daughter-in-law made some very poor decisions after her father's arrest. Instead of laying low, she decided to move money." I scanned the documents, my professional instincts immediately cataloging the transactions. She was trying to liquidate assets before they could be frozen. Exactly. $18 million moved to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore, all within 48 hours of Richard Ashford's arrest. That's not just money laundering, I realized. That's obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud, and destruction of evidence. Agent Chen smiled grimly. "Your daughter-in-law just graduated from potential witness to primary defendant." David sank into his desk chair, staring at the evidence. "She told me she was just consolidating accounts to help with legal fees." "David," I said gently, $18 million is more than most people see in a lifetime. "But there's more," Agent Chen continued. "The transactions Vanessa made led us to accounts we didn't know existed, accounts that contain records going back 40 years. She pulled out another folder. "The Ashford money laundering operation isn't just a family business. It's part of a larger criminal network that includes arms dealing, human trafficking, and drug distribution across the entire eastern seaboard." I felt my breath catch. How large a network? 17 different criminal organizations. Combined revenue of over $3 billion annually. The Ashfords weren't just laundering their own money, they were providing financial services to some of the most dangerous criminal enterprises in North America. David looked up from the bank statements, his face pale. "You're saying Vanessa's family was working with drug dealers?" "And worse," Agent Chen confirmed. "We found transactions linked to a human trafficking ring operating out of Miami for 15 years. The Ashfords provided shipping services and financial laundering for operations that enslaved over 200 women and children." The room fell silent as the full magnitude sank in. This wasn't just white-collar crime anymore. This was something monstrous. "There's something else," Agent Chen said quietly. "Something I think Mrs. Turner needs to know." She pulled out a final document, a wedding guest list from David and Vanessa's reception. "We've been analyzing the attendees at your son's wedding. Do you remember a man named Victor Kozlov, mid-50s, heavily accented, sat at table 12? I remembered him vaguely, a quiet man who'd seemed out of place among the society crowd. Victor Kozlov is the head of a Russian organized crime syndicate based in Brighton Beach. He was at your son's wedding as Richard Ashford's guest." My blood ran cold. "You're saying I was in the same room with one of the most wanted criminals in the country?" "Yes, along with representatives from 3 other major criminal organizations." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "This is insane. None of this can be real. Your wedding reception was essentially a business meeting for the largest criminal enterprise on the East Coast." I thought back to that night, the elegant crowd, the expensive wine, the moment when Vanessa had deliberately humiliated me. That's why she did it, I realized suddenly. That's why Vanessa threw wine on my dress. Both David and Agent Chen looked at me. She was establishing dominance, showing her father's criminal associates that the family could humiliate anyone with impunity. It wasn't just personal cruelty, it was a demonstration of power. Agent Chen nodded slowly. These organizations respect strength and despise weakness. Publicly humiliating someone and getting away with it would have sent a very clear message. David turned from the window, his expression a mixture of horror and fury. She used our wedding to intimidate my mother in front of criminals? Your wedding was never about marriage, David, I said quietly. It was about business. You were just the prop that made it look legitimate. For a moment, my son looked like he might be sick. Then something hardened in his expression, a resolve I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. What do you need me to do? He asked Agent Chen. Testify. Against all of them. We're going to dismantle this entire network, but we need someone on the inside who can verify the family dynamics, the business relationships, the way money flowed through their operations. David looked at me, and I saw the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming. Will you help me? He asked. I thought about the wine-stained dress, then about the 200 enslaved women and children whose suffering had funded my son's fairy tale wedding. Of course, I said. Let's destroy them all. The trial of United States versus Ashford began on a Tuesday morning in October at UNCG, almost exactly 1 year after that disastrous wedding reception. I sat in the gallery watching federal prosecutors lay out their case against Richard Ashford, his daughter Vanessa, and 14 co-conspirators who represented what the media had dubbed the largest organized crime syndicate in Eastern Seaboard history. David sat 3 rows ahead of me, dressed in his best suit, ready to testify against the woman he'd once loved enough to marry. The transformation in my son over the past year had been remarkable. Gone was the naive young man who'd been dazzled by wealth, replaced by someone who understood that integrity couldn't be bought. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh laid out the evidence with surgical precision. 40 years of money laundering, $3 billion in criminal proceeds, connections to human trafficking that had enslaved hundreds of victims. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh said, this case is about a family that built an empire on other people's suffering. They didn't just steal money, they facilitated crimes that destroyed lives. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand knowing that every word would be scrutinized by defense attorneys who'd spent months trying to paint me as a vindictive mother-in-law. Mrs. Turner, Walsh began, please tell the jury how you first became aware of irregularities in Ashford Industries' financial practices. I looked directly at the jury, 12 ordinary Americans who would decide whether justice prevailed. I spilled a drop of water on my daughter-in-law's wedding dress, I said simply. She responded by deliberately throwing wine on my $50,000 rental gown. That incident made me curious about the kind of people I was dealing with. The prosecution methodically walked me through my findings. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the shipping manifests that didn't match customs declarations. I testified for 6 hours, answering every question with the precision that had made me successful as a forensic accountant. Blackwood's cross-examination was predictably vicious. Mrs. Turner, isn't it true that you began this investigation for purely personal reasons? That you were motivated by anger and a desire for revenge? I was motivated by professional curiosity that led to moral obligation, I replied. When you discover evidence of crimes that have harmed hundreds of innocent people, your personal feelings become irrelevant. When David testified the following day, his voice was steady as he described his gradual awakening to his wife's true nature. I thought I was marrying someone who shared my values, he said. Instead, I married someone who viewed compassion as weakness and law-abiding citizens as marks to be exploited. The prosecution's case was airtight, built on financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from former associates. But the moment that sealed everyone's fate came during Vanessa's own testimony. Against her lawyer's advice, she'd insisted on taking the stand, apparently believing she could charm her way out of federal charges. Mrs. Turner, Walsh said during cross-examination, You've testified that you had no knowledge of your family's criminal activities, but you were the president of 3 separate organizations that served as money laundering vehicles. How do you explain that? Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Those were real charities. We helped people. Which people specifically? We provided educational opportunities. To whom? Can you name a single beneficiary of your educational programs? The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Vanessa finally whispered, I don't remember. You don't remember because there were no beneficiaries. Were there? That's when Vanessa made the mistake that destroyed whatever sympathy she might have earned. So what if they were? She snapped. Everyone does it. Everyone with money finds ways to avoid paying taxes. The only difference is we got caught. The courtroom erupted. Judge Martinez banged her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. Vanessa had just confessed to criminal conspiracy in open court while showing complete contempt for the law. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Richard Ashford received 45 years in federal prison. Vanessa got 25 years. 14 co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. 6 months after the trial ended, David and I had lunch at Romano's, the same restaurant where Richard Ashford had tried to buy my silence. Any regrets? My son asked. I thought about the question seriously. A year ago, I'd been a recently divorced woman looking forward to quiet retirement. Now I was a key witness in one of the largest criminal cases in federal history. No, I said finally. No regrets at all. Even about the marriage ending? Especially about the marriage ending. David, you deserve someone who loves you for who you are, not someone who sees you as a convenient cover for criminal activities. He nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee. I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding reception. About consequences. What about it? You told Vanessa she'd just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. Did you know then how big a mistake it actually was? I smiled, remembering that moment when red wine exploded across my dress and I realized I was dealing with someone who'd fundamentally underestimated me. I knew she'd chosen the wrong person to humiliate. I had no idea she'd chosen the worst possible person. The forensic accountant. The forensic accountant, I agreed. With 30 years of experience, unlimited time, and absolutely nothing left to lose. David laughed, the first genuinely happy sound I'd heard from him in over a year. Mom? Yes? Next time I get married, will you run a background check on her first? Sweetheart, I said, next time you get married. I'm running a background check on her entire family, their business associates, and anyone who's ever co-signed a loan with them. Deal. As we finished lunch, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, I'd thought my life was winding down. Instead, I discovered that sometimes your most important work begins when you finally stop accepting other people's limitations on what you're supposed to be capable of. Vanessa Ashford had tried to humiliate a harmless older woman at a society wedding. Instead, she'd awakened a forensic accountant with a lifetime of skills and nothing but time to use them. It had been the biggest mistake of her privileged life, and the best thing that had happened to mine. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.